The earth was getting hotter and hotter. People were burning like raw eggs in the Arizona sunshine. The earth had a problem: global warming. Now, there was a young nymph living in the area, and she called on 3 kids to save the earth. These children, Charles, Vivian, and Richard Miller, were the only hope the earth had to get away from this heat. Now, the nymph explained to them that they would have to go on a journey. This journey consisted of them climbing up a volcano to reach a plant that only existed at the top. Now, this plant, the Ructus plant, was the only thing that could save the earth. This plant was the purest form of life, and if they could bring it back down the volcano, they could replant it among the earth, and global warming would stop. But there was one problem with this journey. The farther and farther up they climbed, the farther and farther back in time they went. They began their journey in 2016 at the base of St. Timotheus volcano. They began traveling up and up, but Richard, the youngest and weakest of the 3, quickly fell behind. But he realized that the sooner he got to the top, the sooner he could get down to the bottom. This was his motivation to begin pumping harder and harder, knowing that he could get home sooner. Vivian and Charles looked to each other, and they knew that it would be up to those 2 to reach the top. They continued to hike until Vivian stopped, and she looked up to the sky, and she noticed that it went from a bright blue to a hazy gray. She looked at her brothers, and she said, "This sounds silly, but when do you think we are?" Charles, the oldest of the 3 and most knowledgeable, pulled out his iPhone 6, only to find a generic flip phone. "Well, whenever we are, it's before iPhones," he said blankly as he pushed the other 2 up the volcano. Charles knew that this was a serious journey, and they couldn't stop to have fun and look around. They hiked and hiked until Charles said, "Let's stop for a drink and have a snack." Vivian grabbed the backpack off of her shoulders and whipped it around to the front, only to find a knapsack filled with a flask and tins full of jerky and soft rolls. Not only had their backpack and snacks changed, but their clothes had changed too. Vivian was now wearing a mid-calf length dress with sturdy shoes and hair past her waist. The boys sported short pants, long stockings, and suspenders with their long-sleeve button-ups tucked into their pants. The 3 of the children began to laugh and laugh until they started to cry. After a good laugh, they kept hiking, but the hike got harder and harder the further up they went, and they began getting impatient and irritable. Again, Richard started to fall behind and began complaining about his legs and how tired he was. And Charles, again, realizing how serious this journey was, got after Rich for complaining. He said, "Richard, if you can't complain anymore, you have to stop complaining and hike up this volcano." Richard quickly got his feelings hurt, and he stopped right there and sat down on a rock, and he said, "You go without me, I'll wait here." And Charles kept on going. He didn't have time to sort out his problems with Richard. Vivian lightly touched Richard on the back and gave him a sweet smile before running to catch up with Charles. "We'll be back," she shouted to Richard. And the other 2 kept on going. And again, the hike was getting harder and harder, so they began to sing Disney songs to keep them motivated to hike up and up and up. After they had sung a few songs, Vivian looked to Charles and she said, "Isn't it amazing that we haven't come up against anything dangerous yet?" Charles nodded and he said, "I hope we don't." They continued to hike and they passed a beautiful medieval castle. Vivian wanted to stop so badly. Charles said, "I know we want to, but we don't have time." As they had just passed the castle, there began to be an earthquake type of feeling, and there was a rumble, and it was so intense that Vivian fell to the ground. Charles put out his hand for Vivian to grab, She popped up and they began walking faster as they knew they were running out of time. At first they thought it was the volcano that was making these rumbles, but they continued in a rhythmic pattern and they knew this can't be the volcano. Charles turned around and noticed what was going on, and he quickly grabbed Vivian and threw her on his back, and he began to race up the volcano. At first Vivian didn't understand, but she slowly turned to look what was behind her. And there was a long neck close behind them, thrashing his neck forward and back, trying to knock them off their feet. "Move faster, Charles!" Vivian yelled. As he began to bob and weave through the bushes and past Longneck's neck, Vivian yelled, "I thought Longnecks were the nice ones!" They continued to run and bob and weave up the volcano until they reached the very top, and they noticed pterodactyls circling over the middle of the volcano hole, and right in the middle, on an island-like formation, sat an orange, spiky Ructus plant. They had found what they were looking for. Not only did they feel the rhythmic earthquake of the long neck, but they also felt the volcano begin to rumble, and they knew they were running out of time. Charles quickly looked from Vivian to the long neck to the Ructus plant, and he knew he'd have to jump. Charles was going to sacrifice himself. But the long neck was getting nearer, and both Vivian and Charles leaped into the air. But they never hit the ground, and Charles took his eyes from squinting closed and slowly opened them and noticed that he was flying. He looked up and noticed that there was a pterodactyl holding him and Vivian in his claws, and from around the pterodactyl's body popped out Richard. "What are you doing up there?" shouted Charles. Richard grinned and said, "I'm saving you, of course." Everybody knows pterodactyls are the nice dinosaurs. As Charles and Vivian began to laugh, the pterodactyl lowered them enough to grab the Ructus plant, and they quickly flew down the volcano. As they flew, the pterodactyl transformed from a pterodactyl into a plane and into a helicopter until they reached the base of the volcano again. And they delivered the Ructus plant to the nymph, who incubated it and planted it among the earth and saved the earth from global warming. And the Miller children had the best adventure of their lives, and they saved the earth. Thank you.